Scott here with a very short announcement before this episode begins. This episode is part of a series I'm doing about history's most insane rulers because I have a book that just came out and is available now called History's 9 Most Insane Rulers, looking at the lives and reigns of people like Emperor Caligula, Ivan the Terrible, Kim Jong-il, and some other lesser-known people like Charles VI, who thought he was made of glass, Ottoman Sultan Ibrahim I, who shot arrows at his court subjects and ordered his advisors to find the fattest woman in the empire to join his harem, and former president of Turkmenistan, Akhbar Turkmenbashi, who had an 80-foot-tall golden statue made of himself that always rotated to face the sun. The book looks at what it would be like to be under the rule of somebody like this who had almost unlimited power, whether power makes somebody go insane, and if these stories have any warnings for us today. So in each of these episodes, I go over a little of what's in the book, but you can go into way more detail if you check it out. You can find it anywhere where books are sold, Amazon or elsewhere. Or if you go to the website mostinsanerulers.com, you'll find a link there, and you'll also find a quiz to determine which insane ruler you are. And if you like the book, if you could please leave a review on Amazon, that'd really help it out. Hope you enjoyed this episode. Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. I want to kick off this episode by asking a question that's not history-related, but has to do with political science and actually mental health. There's a number of mental health professionals who are asking whether our world leaders today are becoming more insane. That has to do with the global growth of populist politicians. Now, whether or not you agree with this list, here's some of them that are typically on it. One is Rodrigo Duterte, who was elected president of the Philippines in May 2016. He campaigned on ending endemic drug trafficking on the island nation by killing thousands of criminals. But his strange personality shone through with lewd responses to a reporter's question where he was making insulting comments about his wife. He used profanity against the Pope in an overwhelmingly Catholic country. When devout voters pushed back, he defended his actions and his salt-of-the-earth persona. He said, "I'm testing the elite of this country because we are fundamentally a feudal country." Beyond his crudeness, Duterte rambles on in a way suggestive of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. He peppers his speeches with jokes, wild exaggerations, and profanities as if there were no barriers dividing his emotions or thoughts or behavior. In one outburst against Barack Obama for the latter's criticism of the Philippines' human rights abuses, he insulted Obama's mother with profanity. And he's hardly alone among boorish world leaders. Another is Brazilian president and fellow populist Jair Bolsonaro, who's made casual jokes about racism and rape and prostitution and using torture against opponents, and he did all these things while he was on the campaign trail. And another well-known showman turned politician in modern Europe, perhaps the best known in recent times, is former Italian President Silvio Berlusconi. He called himself the best political leader in Europe and in the world. He said, "There's no one on the world stage who can compete with me." And he was equally taciturn in deflecting questions on scandals about his private life, especially on relations with younger women and prostitutes. He said, "I never understood where the satisfaction of paying for sex is when you're missing the pleasure of conquest." Now I'm going to pivot for a second and mention why I'm talking about these modern politicians. This episode is the beginning of a multi-part series I'm doing on history's most insane rulers. I did an episode on this topic a couple of years ago, but I really only skimmed the surface. I think this topic can go much deeper because you can find insane rulers from antiquity up to the modern day, and they suffer all kinds of mental illness. Sometimes it's schizophrenia, sometimes it's bipolar disorder, sometimes it's narcissistic personality disorder, megalomania, anything that you can imagine. There's someone who suffered from this, but they also held incredible power, and the lives of thousands or even millions of people hung in the balance because of this. In this series, I'm going to be talking about a number of people, including Roman Emperor Caligula, Charles VI of France in the Middle Ages, who thought he was made of glass, Ottoman Sultan Ibrahim I, who practiced archery on his court subjects and commanded his subjects to find the heaviest woman in the entire empire to be his concubine, which they did. There's also Russian Tsar Ivan the Terrible, who killed and mutilated thousands upon thousands of people. King Ludwig of Bavaria, who would go on midnight sleigh rides through the Bavarian Alps and have imaginary conversations with Louis XIV and Marie Antoinette as he drained his family's fortune to build incredible castles. And then modern-day rulers like Turkmenistani President Sapar Murat Niyazov, who renamed the days of the week and the months of the year after himself and his deceased mother, and even constellations and meteorites and all sorts of other things. And finally, North Korean dear leader Kim Jong-il, who claimed that the first time he golfed, he shot 38 under par. But on a less whimsical note, hundreds of thousands of North Koreans had to suffer in political prisoner camps for insulting him. And if there were a how-to guide on how to create a modern nation state based on 1984, North Korea would basically fit it. Now, one last thing I want to mention about modern-day health professionals talking about growing mental illness among world leaders. I have to address the elephant in the room, and please understand, dear listeners, I'm not trying to get political here. I'm just trying to mention what is on the conversation. But someone who basically tops the list is Donald Trump. There are books about this topic. John Gartner, PhD, he's a founder of an organization called Duty to Warn, an organization focused on warning the United States that Trump's mental illness poses a grave threat to America. He petitioned over 60,000 signatures from mental health professionals. And here's what he said. We, the undersigned mental health professionals, believe in our professional judgment that Donald Trump manifests a serious mental illness that renders him psychologically incapable of competently discharging the duties of President of the United States. And we respectfully request he be removed from office according to Article 4 of the 25th Amendment to the Constitution, which states that the President will be replaced if he is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office. Another author, Justin Frank, who wrote a book called Trump on the Couch, psychoanalyzed him by analyzing historical records from Trump's family, his early years, and his own public record. Other sources include Trump's personal and presidential Twitter stream. He says that Trump sought attention and approval from his family as a young man. His older brother, Fred Jr., pushed hard to succeed and follow in his father's footsteps as a businessman, but he succumbed to alcoholism and died at the age of 43. Donald had the chance to become the favorite son and earn the approval of his father, Fred Sr., who was a demanding figure. Fred Sr. tried to counter Donald's rebelliousness by enrolling him in the New York Military Academy in the 8th grade. And according to Frank, because he never got over feelings of rejection and abandonment, he formed dangerous mental traits such as grandiosity, projection, bullying, fear of weakness and shame, lack of empathy, and habitual lying. All right, now again, I'm not going to get political here and talk about modern-day figures, but I want to use this as a chance to pivot and say that this conversation that's happening among people right now is a conversation that goes back for centuries and centuries and millennia, and our test subjects of political leaders who may or may not have mental illness are much more stark in their actions. So what we're going to look at in this series is the lives of the most insane leaders in history and how they led their kingdoms, nations, and empires with frayed connections to reality. We'll look at the addictive nature of power, the effects it has on those who cling to it for too long, and the methods by which insane rulers led without their full mental faculties intact. And we'll also look at why senior government officials tolerated their actions for so long. Finally, we'll look at whether or not insane rulers are a relic of the past and have died out in the age of democracy, or not. Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. Before we venture too far into our analysis of insane rulers, we have to define what insanity or madness or these other terms are. Doing so is challenging because there's no universally accepted definition of what we call madness. There's only a legal definition of insanity. These terms cover a spectrum of abnormal behaviors and mental patterns, everything from agoraphobia to the condition formerly known as multiple personality disorder. Doctors have been arguing about the origin of madness since the beginning of medicine. Some thought that insanity was a disease of the soul. Traditional societies thought the source was evil spirits that needed to be exorcised. Others thought it was a disease of the body. Ancient Greeks regarded madness as an imbalance in bodily humors, the chemical systems that regulated human behavior. The four humors were blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Social and cultural dimensions are also crucial to understanding madness because it's been recognized in every known society throughout history. Andrew Scull is the author of the book Madness and Civilization, and he notes that madness is a universal feature of human existence and can be found in the most ancient sources. For example, the Old Testament is full of stories of madness. In one famous episode, King Saul, the first monarch of the Israelites, falls into madness, and he does so for failing to follow God's order to destroy completely the enemy of Israel, the Amalekites. Another famous episode of biblical madness involves Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king. He conquers Jerusalem, destroys Solomon's temple, and takes the young Daniel and other Israelites into captivity. Daniel becomes one of his close advisors and sees the onset of Nebuchadnezzar's madness. Nebuchadnezzar boasts obnoxiously about his power and finally moves God to act. Forced from his palace, Nebuchadnezzar goes into the wilderness, his mind shriveled to the level of an ox. There he eats grass, and according to the passage in Daniel, his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hairs were grown like eagle's feathers and his nails like bird's claws. The king remained in that state for 7 years until he acknowledged that God rules his kingdom, not him. With Nebuchadnezzar's reason and ability to rationalize returned to him, he praises God and proclaims his dominion lasts forever. Whatever the truth of this story, the Old Testament treats Nebuchadnezzar's case of madness as a divine curse, not something biological in origin. Other ancient accounts of madness also describe it in supernatural terms. Ancient Greece and Rome treated the mentally ill with temple medicine from the gods, and they used charms, purification rites, and spells. There's also a spiritual idea of a sacred form of madness. This idea is found in the concept of the holy fool, and this played a leading role in the imagination of medieval Christendom. He was like a biblical prophet who flouted society's conventions and served a religious purpose. What the holy fool did was reveal truths hidden to the wise. Most famous was Basil the Blessed, a Russian Orthodox saint known as a Yurodivy, or Holy Fool for Christ. He was born in the late 15th century, and the legends go that he went naked and weighed himself down with chains to show contempt for his own flesh and to shun any recognition. But with this rejection of the world came total freedom to scorn wickedness. When Ivan the Terrible moved toward Pskov after devastating the city of Novgorod in the 16th century and killing thousands and thousands of the people there for political reasons, which we'll talk about later in the series when we look at Ivan the Terrible, Basil alone stood up to him. Russian medievalist Eugene Volodotkin recounts one legend in which Basil offered Ivan a piece of raw meat out of quote-unquote hospitality. Ivan responded he didn't eat meat during the fast. Basil retorted that the Tsar had done far worse by devouring the flesh of Christians. So, as the legend goes, the Tsar was startled and returned to Moscow without harming the people. Over time, methods arose to understand and treat madness based more on science. The followers of the ancient Greek physician Hippocrates, and later the Greco-Roman physician Galen, considered madness to result from mental and physical conditions. However, as treatment methods evolved, the public clung to many old beliefs and remained skeptical of doctors' ability to cure madness, and this lasted well into the 19th century. The Renaissance artist Hieronymus Bosch provides an example of this skepticism with the 1494 satirical painting, The Cure of Folly, The Extraction of the Stone of Folly. A doctor dons a dunce's cap, and he uses a scalpel to draw from a patient's scalp what is the cause of his madness. So, because the origins of madness are so heavily disputed by mental health experts across history and even today, where many will argue that there's simply no universal definition of what this is, in this series we're only going to be concerned with the effects of insanity, not its causes. We're going to use the legal term for insanity regarding a defendant's capacity to determine right from wrong in the case of a crime. In this case, it's defined as mental illnesses of such a severe nature that a person cannot distinguish fantasy from reality, cannot conduct her or his affairs due to psychosis, or is subject to uncontrollable impulsive behavior. So this is the launching point to analyze the psychosis, megalomania, and paranoia of our rulers in question. Based on this definition of insanity, the insane rulers that we're going to look at were chosen based on one of three criteria. The first is disassociation from reality. French king, the Charles V, thought he was made of glass and could shatter any moment. Ottoman Sultan Ibrahim I thought he was a king from a fairy tale and ordered a massive tax to fund the decoration of his palace from floor to ceiling in sable fur. The second criterion is psychopathy and lack of remorse. Ivan the Terrible personally tortured, raped, and murdered his subjects. Idi Amin killed up to 500,000 Ugandans in the 1960s and 1970s. The third criterion is narcissistic personality disorder and megalomania. Roman Emperor Caligula referred to himself as a god. Turkmenistani president Sapar Murat Niyazov, as I mentioned earlier, renamed days of the week and months of the year after himself and his family. Kim Jong-il demanded his portrait be in every North Korean home alongside his father's. So, along with looking at the background of these people, we're also going to ask 6 questions about their time in power.